They found the wedding dress buried in the backyard, still stained with blood that was never explained. It was a cold morning in March 1979 when Detective Sarah Morgan received a call that would haunt her for the rest of her career. The voice on the other end was trembling, barely able to form words. A construction crew, breaking ground for a new shopping center in Millbrook County, had unearthed something that made even the most seasoned workers step back in horror. Not bodies, not bones, but something far more disturbing. A collection of items buried 3 feet underground. Wedding rings engraved with dates that didn't make sense, photographs of ceremonies that should never have happened, and documents that would eventually unravel one of the darkest family secrets in American history. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back. Back to 1965. Back to a house that neighbors called the greenhouse, though no one could remember why. The paint had long faded to a sickly gray, and the windows were always covered, even during the brightest summer days. Millbrook County, Virginia. Summer 1965. The town of Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Population 3,247. One main street. 2 churches. A diner that served the same meatloaf every Wednesday for 30 years. It was quiet, safe, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and children played outside until the streetlights came on. But there was one house where children never played, one yard where no laughter echoed, one driveway where visitors never parked, the house at 1847 Ashwood Lane. People who lived on that street would later tell investigators they always felt something was wrong, not in a way they could explain to the police or even to themselves. It was a feeling, a coldness that seemed to radiate from that property even on the hottest days of August. The house belonged to a man named Richard Holloway. Richard Holloway was 42 years old in the summer of 1965. Tall, over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, dark hair graying at the temples. He had the kind of face that could look kind one moment and terrifying the next. His eyes were pale blue, almost translucent, and when he looked at you, it felt like he was reading every thought you'd ever had. He worked as an accountant at a local manufacturing plant, kept to himself, rarely smiled. When neighbors saw him, he would nod politely but never stop to talk. His presence carried weight, the kind that made conversation stop when he entered a room. Richard had moved to Millbrook in 1963 with his 3 daughters. No wife, no explanation. The girls were homeschooled, rarely seen, and when they did appear, at the grocery store, at the post office, they were always silent, always looking down. Their names were Marianne, Catherine, and Eloise. In 1965, Marianne was 17. Catherine was 15. Eloise was 13. Marianne had long dark hair that fell past her shoulders. Even in summer heat, she wore long sleeves. Her eyes were brown, deep and sad, and she had a habit of biting her lower lip when nervous, which was always. She moved like someone who had learned to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible. Catherine was different. Lighter hair, almost blonde. She was taller than her sisters, with a defiant streak that hadn't been fully crushed yet. Sometimes, if you looked carefully, you could see anger flash in her green eyes before she quickly looked away. She clenched her fists when she walked. Eloise, the youngest, was pale and thin. Too thin. Her cheeks were hollow and dark circles ringed her eyes. She barely spoke, even to her sisters. When she did, her voice was so soft you had to lean in to hear. She had a habit of touching her wrist, over and over, as if checking for something that wasn't there. The 3 sisters were rarely apart. When they went into town, they moved as one unit, close together, almost touching. They never made eye contact with strangers. They never asked questions. They bought what they needed and left. Cashiers would later remember them. One woman told police, "They looked like ghosts, like they were already dead but didn't know it yet." The first sign that something was deeply wrong came in late August 1965. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard lived 2 houses down from the Holloways. She was 73, a widow, and spent most of her days watching the neighborhood from her front porch. She knew everyone's routines. Who left for work at what time? Which kids cut through her yard on their way to school? Who was having an affair with whom? And she noticed things about the house at 1847 Ashwood Lane. She noticed that the girls never played outside, that curtains were drawn at all hours, that sometimes, late at night, she could hear sounds coming from that house. Not quite shouting, not quite crying, something in between, a sound that made her pull her blankets tighter and pray for morning. But it was what she saw on August 23rd that made her call her son. It was 6:47 in the evening, still light outside. She was watering her roses when she saw the oldest girl, Mary Ann, standing in the front yard of the Holloway house, just standing there, staring at the street. Eleanor waved, smiled, called out, "Evening, dear." Mary Ann didn't respond, didn't move. She just stood there, barefoot on the grass, wearing a white dress that looked too big for her. Her hair hung loose around her face, and then Eleanor saw her lips moving. She couldn't hear what Mary Ann was saying, but she was speaking, whispering something over and over. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers laced together so tightly her knuckles were white. Eleanor took a step closer, squinting in the fading light. That's when Richard Holloway appeared. He emerged from the house without a sound, moving fast. He grabbed Mary Ann's arm, not roughly but firmly, and guided her back inside. Before the door closed, he turned and looked directly at Eleanor. His expression was blank, empty, but his eyes— Eleanor would tell her son later, his eyes were like ice, like he could see right through me, and I knew, I don't know how, but I knew that something terrible was happening in that house. She called her son that night, told him she was worried about those girls. He told her to mind her business. Small towns didn't like people who stirred up trouble, so Eleanor said nothing more. But she started keeping a journal, writing down everything she observed about the house at 1847 Ashwood Lane. She would give that journal to the police 14 years later. Inside the house, the air was different, heavy, thick with something unspoken. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. The curtains were heavy velvet, always drawn. Even in daytime, the house existed in permanent twilight. There were rules in that house, rules the girls had learned long ago. Rules that were never written down but were carved into their bones through years of careful conditioning. Rule 1. Never open the curtains. Rule 2. Never speak to neighbors. Rule 3. Never ask questions. Rule 4. Never disobey father. Father, that's what they called him. Not dad, not daddy. Father. The word carried weight, authority, fear. The house had 4 bedrooms upstairs. Richard had the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The 3 girls shared one room, even though there were 2 other bedrooms available. They slept in a single room with 3 small beds lined up against the wall, like a dormitory. The other 2 bedrooms were locked. Always. The girls never asked what was inside. Dinner was at 6:30 p.m. every evening, never a minute late. The girls would set the table in silence. 4 plates, 4 glasses, 4 sets of silverware, perfectly aligned. Richard would sit at the head of the table. The girls would sit in their assigned seats, the same seats they'd occupied for as long as they could remember. Mary Ann on his right, Catherine on his left, Eloise at the far end, facing him. They would bow their heads. Richard would say, "Grace," the same grace every night. "Lord, bless this food and this family. May we remain loyal, obedient, and pure. Amen." Then they would eat, in silence, eyes on their plates. After dinner, the girls would wash dishes. Richard would retire to his study, another locked room. They would hear him in there, sometimes on the phone, speaking in low tones, sometimes typing, sometimes just sitting in silence, At 9 p.m., they would go upstairs, brush their teeth, change into nightgowns, get into their beds. And they would wait. Sometimes Richard would come upstairs, sometimes he wouldn't. But they would always wait, lying perfectly still under their covers, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps in the hallway. On September 3, 1965, something changed. Marianne turned 18. She was now legally an adult, old enough to leave if she wanted to, old enough to make her own choices. But she didn't leave. Instead, on the morning of her 18th birthday, Richard called her into his study. She was inside for 47 minutes. When she emerged, her face was blank. Expressionless. Her sisters watched from the top of the stairs, holding their breath. Marianne walked past them without a word and went into the bathroom. They heard water running, heard her crying, very softly, trying to muffle the sound. Catherine started toward the bathroom, but Eloise grabbed her arm, shaking her head. They'd learned long ago. Comfort brings attention. Attention brings punishment. So they sat on the stairs and waited until their sister stopped crying. That night at dinner, Richard made an announcement. "Marianne will be going on a trip," he said, cutting his meat with precise movements. "She'll be gone for a few weeks. Perhaps longer." Catherine looked up sharply. "Where?" "That's not your concern," Richard interrupted, not raising his voice. He didn't need to. The tone was enough. Catherine's jaw clenched, but she said nothing more. Eloise stared at her plate, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. Marianne sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on something far away. 3 days later, Marianne was gone. No one saw her leave. No one saw a car. One morning she was there, and by evening her bed was empty. The house felt different without her, quieter, even more oppressive. Catherine and Eloise barely spoke, even to each other. They moved through their routines like automatons, waiting for their sister to return. Weeks passed, then months. Marianne didn't come back, and no one in town seemed to notice she was gone. Winter came early to Millbrook that year. By November, snow covered the ground and the temperature dropped below freezing. The house at 1847 Ashwood Lane looked even more isolated, a dark shape against the white landscape. Eleanor Pritchard continued to watch, continued to write in her journal. November 18th, 1965. Haven't seen the oldest girl in months. Only the 2 younger ones go to town now. They look even thinner. More frightened. December 2nd, 1965. Lights on in the house at strange hours. 3 a.m., 4 a.m. What are they doing in there? December 20th, 1965. Saw the middle girl, Catherine, standing at the window today. She was looking out through a gap in the curtains. When I waved, she pulled back so fast like she'd been burned. Eleanor wanted to do something. Call someone. But who? The police? And say what? That she had a bad feeling? That the girls looked sad? In 1965, people didn't interfere in family matters. What happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors. So Eleanor kept watching, kept writing, and prayed she was wrong about everything her instincts were screaming. On Christmas Eve, 1965, Marianne returned. She arrived in the evening, just after dark. A car pulled up to the house, a black sedan that no one recognized. Marianne got out, carrying a small suitcase. She looked different, older, broken in a way that went beyond physical changes. She walked to the front door, paused, took a deep breath, and went inside. Eleanor saw all of this from her window. She noted it in her journal. Christmas Eve. The oldest girl is back. She's changed. God help her. God help them all. That night, the Holloway family sat down for Christmas Eve dinner. 4 plates, 4 glasses, 4 sets of silverware. Richard said grace. Lord, bless this food and this family. May we remain loyal, obedient, and pure. Amen. They ate in silence. But something was different. There was a tension in the air, thick and suffocating. After dinner, Richard stood. "Mary Ann, come to my study." She rose without a word and followed him. Catherine and Eloise remained at the table, frozen, listening to their father's study door close with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. And in that moment, sitting at that table with the remains of Christmas dinner growing cold, Catherine made a decision. She didn't know what it was yet, not fully formed, but a seed had been planted, a seed of resistance, a seed that would take years to grow but would eventually tear this family's darkest secrets into the light. Some secrets are so dark that even silence has a weight. The winter of 1966 transformed Millbrook into a frozen wasteland. Snow piled high against houses, and the wind howled through empty streets like a warning no one wanted to hear. Inside the house at 1847 Ashwood Lane, something was shifting. Something irreversible. Catherine noticed it first. January 14th, 1966, 2:47 a.m., Catherine woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate, stopping at their bedroom door. She held her breath, her body rigid under the thin blanket. Beside her, Eloise was curled into a ball, pretending to sleep. Across the room, Mary Ann's bed was empty. It had been empty every night since she returned from her trip. The footsteps moved past their door, down the hallway, down the stairs. Catherine waited until she heard the study door close before she moved. She slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept to the window. Through a gap in the curtains she could see the backyard bathed in moonlight. And there, standing in the snow in nothing but her nightgown, was Mary Ann. She was digging, her bare hands clawing at the frozen earth, her breath coming out in visible clouds. She dug with a desperate intensity, her fingers bleeding, leaving red streaks in the white snow. Catherine's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to run down there, to pull her sister inside to demand answers. But fear kept her frozen at the window. After 20 minutes, Mary Ann stopped digging. She pulled something from her pocket, Catherine couldn't see what, and buried it in the shallow hole. Then she covered it, patted the snow back into place, and stood there, swaying slightly. When she finally turned to come back inside, Catherine saw her sister's face clearly in the moonlight. Mary Ann was smiling. But it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of someone who had broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. The smile of someone who had given up. Catherine stumbled back from the window and crawled into bed, pulling the covers over her head, her whole body shaking. The next morning, at breakfast, no one mentioned the incident. Mary Ann sat at her assigned seat, her hands bandaged with strips of cloth. Richard glanced at them but said nothing. Catherine kept her eyes on her plate, afraid that if she looked up her father would somehow know she'd been awake. That she'd seen. Eloise ate mechanically, her face blank, her movements automated. "Catherine," Richard said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. She looked up, her throat tight. "Yes, Father?" "You'll be 15 in March." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a reminder, a warning. "Yes, Father," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his pale blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Good. We'll discuss your future soon." Her future. The words hung in the air like a threat. Mary Ann's fork clattered against her plate. Catherine glanced at her sister and saw tears streaming down her face, though Mary Ann made no sound. She just kept crying silently, mechanically bringing food to her mouth, chewing, swallowing. Richard ignored her completely, as if she wasn't even there. February brought no relief. The cold intensified. The snow kept falling. And inside the house the atmosphere grew more suffocating with each passing day. Catherine began finding things. Small things that didn't belong. A torn piece of paper tucked under her pillow with a single word written in Mary Ann's handwriting. "Run." A note hidden in the bathroom medicine cabinet. He owns us. He will never let us go. A scrap of fabric, white lace like from a wedding dress, stuffed between the mattress and box spring of Mary Ann's bed. Catherine collected these fragments like pieces of a puzzle she was terrified to complete. She hid them in a loose floorboard under her bed, checking every night to make sure they were still there. Eloise had stopped speaking entirely. She moved through the house like a ghost, her eyes vacant, her movements mechanical. At night, Catherine would hear her youngest sister crying, muffled sounds barely audible through the darkness. But when Catherine tried to comfort her, Eloise would pull away, shaking her head violently, her eyes wide with terror. Whatever Mary Ann had experienced during those months away, Eloise somehow knew it was coming for her too. March 3rd, 1966, Catherine's 15th birthday. She woke that morning with a sense of dread so heavy she could barely breathe. She knew what was coming, had known for months. But knowing didn't make it easier. At breakfast, Richard was pleasant, almost cheerful. He smiled at her, a cold, calculating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Happy birthday, Catherine." "Thank you, Father," she managed. "After school, we'll have a special dinner. Just the two of us." Her blood turned to ice. "What about?" "Just the two of us," he repeated, his voice firm but not angry. Never angry. Richard never raised his voice. He never had to. Mary Ann was staring at her plate, trembling. Eloise had her eyes closed, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer. That afternoon, Catherine made a decision. While Richard was at work and her sisters were occupied upstairs, she snuck into his study. The door was unlocked. He'd never had to lock it before. His daughters were too well trained to disobey. But desperation makes rebels of the obedient. The study was exactly as she expected. Dark wood, leather furniture, filing cabinets that lined the walls. His desk was immaculate, not a paper out of place. Everything organized with obsessive precision. Catherine's hands shook as she opened the drawers. The first contained office supplies. The second, financial documents. The third. She froze. Inside the third drawer was a metal box, locked, but the key was taped to the underside of the drawer, another sign of Richard's arrogance. He never expected his daughters to look. With trembling fingers, Catherine unlocked the box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, and as she looked through them, her stomach twisted with horror and understanding. Mary Ann, in a white dress. Standing next to their father, both smiling, her hand wearing a ring. Another photo, Mary Ann and Richard, cutting a cake. Another, Mary Ann in a veil, looking at the camera with dead eyes. They were wedding photos. Catherine's vision blurred. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the pictures. But she forced herself to keep looking, to understand. There were certificates, official-looking documents with forged signatures, marriage licenses with false names but real photos. And at the bottom of the box, a journal, Richard's journal. Catherine flipped it open and read, "The girls must understand their purpose. They were born to serve me, to belong to me in every way. Society's rules don't apply within these walls. I am their father, their teacher, their husband, their God." Mary Ann understands now. Catherine will be next. Then Eloise. They will all fulfill their destiny. The words swam before her eyes. She read entry after entry, each more disturbing than the last, detailed accounts of manipulation, control, and violations too terrible to fully comprehend. But one entry, dated December 20th, 1965, made her blood run cold. Mary Ann is pregnant. This complicates things, but it also ensures her permanent loyalty. She can never leave now, never tell. The shame would destroy her. She belongs to me completely. Catherine's hands flew to her mouth, suppressing a scream. Mary Ann, pregnant. with their father's child. She heard a sound downstairs, the front door opening. He was home early. Panic flooded through her. Catherine shoved everything back into the box, locked it, replaced the key, and ran out of the study. She made it to the kitchen just as Richard walked in. He looked at her, his head tilting slightly. "Catherine, why are you breathing so hard?" I was upstairs. I ran down when I heard the door. I thought maybe you'd brought home something for dinner." He studied her for a long moment. Too long, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then he smiled. "No, but I did bring something for you. A gift. Come to the dining room." She followed on shaking legs. On the dining room table was a white dress. Not quite a wedding dress, but close. Formal, expensive, beautiful in a way that made Catherine want to vomit. "For tonight," Richard said, "for our special dinner. 6:30 p.m. Catherine sat at the dining room table wearing the white dress. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. Richard planned everything. Marianne and Eloise had been sent to their room. It was just Catherine and her father, sitting across from each other in candlelight. He'd cooked her favorite meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. It all tasted like ashes in her mouth. "You're 15 now," Richard said, cutting his meat with precise movements. "A woman, ready to take on new responsibilities." Catherine said nothing. Her hands were clenched in her lap so tightly her nails drew blood. "I've thought a lot about your future," he continued, "about what's best for you, and I've decided that in 6 months, when you turn 16, we'll have a ceremony, a commitment ceremony, just like Marianne and I did." There it was, the truth laid bare. Catherine looked up, meeting her father's eyes for the first time. "What about Marianne? What about her? You're already—" The words stuck in her throat. Richard smiled. "Catherine, love isn't limited. I have room in my heart for all my daughters. You'll understand soon. You'll all understand. We're a family, and families should be close as possible." The calm, reasonable tone of his voice was somehow worse than if he'd been shouting. He truly believed what he was saying. There was no doubt in his eyes, no shame. "What if I say no?" The words came out before Catherine could stop them. The smile faded from Richard's face. Not replaced by anger, but by something colder. Disappointment. "Oh, Catherine," he said softly. "You won't say no, because if you do, I'll move on to Eloise. She's only 13, but I can wait. And believe me, she's much more fragile than you are. You're strong. You can handle this. But Eloise? This would break her. Completely. Is that what you want?" Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. He had her. He knew it. She knew it. She was trapped. That night, Catherine lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Beside her, Eloise was crying softly. Across the room, Marianne sat on her bed, one hand resting on her stomach, which Catherine now realized had begun to show a slight curve. "I'm sorry," Marianne whispered into the darkness. "I'm so sorry, Catherine. I should have warned you, should have done something, but You were scared," Catherine finished. "We're all scared." Eloise's small voice came from the darkness. For a long time, they sat in silence. 3 sisters. 3 prisoners. 3 victims of a man who had stolen their childhood, their innocence, their future. But then Catherine spoke, her voice steady despite her tears. "We have to get out." "We can't," Marianne said immediately. "He'll find us. He always—" "We have to try," Catherine insisted. "If we don't, this will never end. It'll just keep happening. To us. To—" She glanced at Marianne's stomach. "To our children. To everyone. We have to stop him." "How?" Eloise asked, her voice barely audible. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out. I promise you both. I'm going to get us out of this house, even if it kills me." March turned to April. April to May. Catherine began planning. Carefully, secretly. She collected money from the grocery budget, hiding coins and small bills in her floorboard hiding place. She studied Richard's schedule, noting when he was at work, when he was home, when he went out. She also started documenting everything, writing down dates, incidents, conversations, building evidence, though she didn't know yet who she'd show it to. Marianne's pregnancy became impossible to hide. Her stomach swelled. She moved slowly, one hand always resting on her belly. Richard seemed pleased, his attention focused on her in a way that gave Catherine and Eloise temporary relief. But they all knew it was temporary. Catherine's 16th birthday was approaching. The ceremony was coming, and Catherine had no plan, no way out, no one to turn to, until Eleanor Pritchard knocked on their door. June 15th, 1966, 10:23 a.m. Richard was at work. The girls were home alone, as always. When the knock came, they froze. No one ever knocked on their door. Catherine crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. It was the old woman from down the street, Mrs. Pritchard. Another knock. "Hello? Girls, I know you're home. I need to talk to you. Please." Catherine looked at her sisters. Marianne shook her head frantically. Eloise had gone pale. But something in Eleanor's voice, desperation, concern, fear, made Catherine open the door. Just a crack. Eleanor stood on the porch, her hands clasped in front of her. Up close, she looked ancient, fragile, but her eyes were sharp, knowing. "I don't have much time," Eleanor said quietly. "Your father will be home in 2 hours. I need you to listen to me carefully." Catherine nodded, unable to speak. "I know what's happening in this house," Eleanor continued. "I don't know all of it, but I know enough. I've been watching, writing things down, and I want to help you." "You can't," Catherine whispered. "No one can. Maybe not, but I can try, and I think I know someone who might believe you, a social worker in the next county. She's helped girls before, girls in situations like yours." Hope? Dangerous, painful hope bloomed in Catherine's chest. "I can't talk now," she said quickly. "He'll know. He knows everything." "Tomorrow," Eleanor said. 10 a.m. I'll be at the diner on Main Street. If you can get away, come find me. All 3 of you if possible. We'll figure something out, I promise." Before Catherine could respond, Eleanor turned and walked away, moving faster than seemed possible for a woman her age. Catherine closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. Marianne was staring at her, tears streaming down her face. "Don't," she pleaded. "Don't give us hope. It's worse when you have hope." But Catherine shook her head. "Tomorrow. We're going tomorrow." "He'll know," Eloise whispered. "I don't care," Catherine said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We're running out of time. My birthday is in 3 months. We have to try." That night, at dinner, Richard made an announcement. "I have to go out of town tomorrow," he said. "Business meeting in Richmond. I'll be gone all day. I expect you girls to behave, to follow the rules, to stay inside." Catherine kept her face neutral, but inside, her heart was racing. Tomorrow. He'd be gone all day tomorrow. It was a sign. It had to be. "Yes, Father," the 3 girls said in unison. Richard smiled. "Good girls. I knew I could trust you." June 16th, 1966, 9:47 a.m. Richard's car pulled out of the driveway at 9:30. The girls watched from the window until it disappeared around the corner. Then Catherine turned to her sisters. "Get dressed. We're leaving. Now." "Catherine," Marianne began. "Now," Catherine repeated. "Marianne, you're 7 months pregnant. If we don't leave now, you're going to have that baby in this house. Is that what you want?" Marianne's hand went to her stomach. After a moment, she shook her head. Eloise? The youngest sister nodded slowly. They dressed quickly. Catherine grabbed the money she'd hidden, the evidence she'd collected, and one of Marianne's notes as proof. They walked out the front door at 9:55 a.m. 5 minutes later, they walked into the diner on Main Street. Eleanor was there, sitting in a back booth, nursing a cup of coffee. When she saw them, relief flooded her face. "Thank God," she breathed. "Sit down, quickly." They slid into the booth. A waitress approached, but Eleanor waved her away. "I called my contact," Eleanor said, speaking fast and low. "She's coming. She'll be here in an hour. She's bringing people who can help, social workers, maybe police. But you have to tell them everything, every detail, no matter how hard it is. Can you do that?" Catherine nodded. Beside her, Marianne was crying silently. Eloise stared at the table, her whole body shaking. "Good," Eleanor said. "You're safe now. I won't let him—" The bell above the diner door chimed. They all looked up. Richard stood in the doorway. His eyes found them immediately, and the look on his face, cold, calculating, furious, made Catherine's blood turn to ice. He hadn't gone to Richmond. He'd been testing them, and they'd failed. Sometimes the only way to escape darkness is to drag it into the light. The diner went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every fork froze midair. All eyes turned to the man standing in the doorway and the 3 terrified girls huddled in the back booth. Richard Holloway smiled, not his cold, calculating smile. Something worse, something almost amused. "Girls," he said softly, his voice carrying across the room despite its quietness, "I think you forgot something at home." Catherine's mind raced. They were in public, surrounded by witnesses. He couldn't do anything here, could he? But then she saw it, the way people were looking at them, not with concern, with discomfort, with the desire to look away, to pretend they hadn't seen anything, to avoid getting involved, because that's what people did in 1966. They minded their own business. Eleanor stood up, her frail body trembling but her voice steady. "These girls are staying here. I've called someone. Help is coming." Richard's gaze shifted to the elderly woman. For a moment, something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that pleasant, reasonable expression he wore so well. "Mrs. Pritchard, isn't it?" He took a step into the diner. "I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter. My daughters simply had a misunderstanding about today's schedule. I'm here to take them home." "No." The word burst from Catherine's mouth before she could stop it. She stood up, her legs shaking. "We're not going back." The diner's attention was fully on them now. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter. 2 men in work clothes exchanged uncomfortable glances. A woman with her young daughter quickly gathered her things to leave. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Catherine, don't make a scene." "A scene?" Catherine's voice was rising, years of suppressed rage finally finding an outlet. "You want to talk about scenes? Should I tell everyone here what you've done? What you're planning to do?" "Catherine!" Marianne grabbed her arm, her voice panicked, but Catherine shook her off. Something had broken inside her. The fear that had controlled her for so long suddenly seemed less powerful than the truth. "She's pregnant," Catherine announced, pointing at Marianne. 7 months pregnant, and our father is the father of that baby." The diner erupted in shocked murmurs. Someone gasped. The waitress dropped a plate. Richard's expression finally cracked. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said quietly, his voice laced with threat. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Catherine shot back. "I'm telling the truth. He's been assaulting us for years. He married Marianne, had some fake ceremony in a church 2 counties over, and he was planning to do the same to me. Then Eloise." "That's enough." Richard's voice finally rose and several people in the diner jumped. He took another step forward. You're confused, traumatized by your mother's passing. You're making up stories. Our mother didn't pass, Catherine screamed. You made her disappear, just like you've made us disappear. We're prisoners in that house. Eleanor stepped between Richard and the girls, her small frame somehow commanding. The police are coming. I called them before the girls even arrived. You're not taking them anywhere. Richard's eyes narrowed. He glanced around the diner, calculating. Several men had stood up, uncertain but ready to intervene if necessary. The waitress was on the phone, probably calling for help. He was cornered. And cornered animals are the most dangerous. Fine, Richard said, his voice suddenly calm. Too calm. If that's how you want to play this, Catherine, then let's play. He reached into his jacket pocket. Several people tensed, but he pulled out not a weapon but a photograph. He held it up for the diner to see. This is my daughter, Catherine, he said, his voice taking on a tone of wounded authority. She's mentally unstable, has been since her mother's tragic death 3 years ago. She creates elaborate fantasies, accuses people of terrible things. I've been trying to get her help, but— Liar! Catherine lunged forward, but Eleanor caught her. Richard continued, his voice growing more emotional, more believable. I've been raising these girls alone, doing everything I can, but Catherine has always been troubled, violent sometimes. I have documentation from doctors, psychiatric evaluations. Fake, Catherine shouted. It's all fake. But she could see it working. The doubt creeping into people's faces. The way they were looking at her now. Not with sympathy, but with uncertainty. After all, she was screaming, emotional, while Richard stood calm and rational. Who would they believe? The hysterical teenage girl or the respectable businessman? That's when Mary Ann stood up. She'd been silent through the entire confrontation, one hand resting on her swollen belly, tears streaming down her face. But now she stepped forward, her voice quiet but clear. He's telling the truth. Catherine is telling the truth. Richard's mask slipped for just a second. Mary Ann, sit down. No. Mary Ann's voice grew stronger. I'm done being quiet, done being afraid. You hurt me. You violated me. You made me believe I had no choice, that I deserved this, that it was normal. But it's not normal, and I won't let you do it to my sisters. She turned to face the diner full of strangers, her hands shaking but her voice steady. My name is Mary Ann Holloway. I'm 17 years old. 7 months ago, the man who raised me, my father, forced me into a relationship I never consented to. He took me to a church where a man he paid performed a fake marriage ceremony. Then he— Her voice broke, but she pushed through. This baby I'm carrying is his. I tried to run away twice. Both times he found me, brought me back. Locked me in my room for weeks. I have scars on my wrists from— She held up her arms, showing the faint marks of restraints, from where he tied me down. The diner was silent. Completely silent. Even Richard seemed momentarily frozen, perhaps shocked that his eldest daughter, his most broken, most compliant victim, had found her voice. Eloise stood next, her small voice adding to the testimony. He touches us. At night, when he thinks the others are asleep. He tells us it's love. That families should be this close. But I know it's wrong. I've always known. That's when the sirens began wailing in the distance. 2 police cars pulled up in front of the diner within minutes. Officers Harold Dawson and Marcus Reed entered, hands near their weapons, surveying the tense scene. Eleanor immediately approached them, speaking in rapid, urgent tones. Richard straightened, his mask of respectability sliding back into place. Officers, thank God you're here. My daughters are having some kind of breakdown, making wild accusations. I think they need psychiatric help. Sir, please step outside, Officer Dawson interrupted, his tone neutral but firm. But I'm their father. Outside. Now. As Richard was led out, Officer Reed approached the girls. He was younger, maybe 30, with kind eyes that made Catherine want to cry with relief. "Are you girls okay? Are you hurt?" Catherine shook her head. "Not physically. Not right now. But we need help. We need to not go back to that house," Marianne finished, her voice desperate. "Please, you have to believe us." Officer Reed glanced at Marianne's pregnant belly, at Eloise's terrified face, at Catherine's desperate eyes. Then he nodded slowly. "We're going to take you somewhere safe, all three of you, and we're going to sort this out. But I need you to be completely honest with me. Can you do that?" They nodded in unison. The next 6 hours were a blur of questions, examinations, and revelations. The girls were taken to the county hospital where female doctors and nurses examined them, found evidence of trauma, long-term abuse, scars both physical and psychological. Marianne's pregnancy was confirmed. Genetic testing would later prove Richard was indeed the father. Meanwhile, police executed a search warrant on the house at 1847 Ashwood Lane. What they found made even seasoned investigators sick. The locked bedrooms upstairs weren't bedrooms at all. One had been converted into a photographic studio with lighting equipment and cameras. Hundreds of photographs were hidden in filing cabinets, evidence of years of documentation. The other locked room contained restraints, medical equipment, drugs used for sedation. Richard's study yielded his journals, detailed accounts of his crimes dating back to 1963, plans for each daughter, documentation of the fake marriage ceremonies. And in the backyard, where Eleanor had seen Marianne digging that winter night, police found something buried in the ground. A small metal box containing a wedding ring and a note in Marianne's handwriting that simply read, "I tried to be dead, but I'm still alive. Someone please find this." Richard Holloway was arrested that evening. He maintained his innocence, claimed his daughters were lying, that Eleanor Pritchard had manipulated them, that the evidence was fabricated. But the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. As word spread through Millbrook, people remembered things. Small signs they'd ignored, strange behaviors they'd dismissed, the way those girls never smiled, the way they flinched at sudden movements, the way they disappeared for months at a time. One neighbor remembered hearing screaming one night but convinced herself it was the TV. Another remembered seeing Marianne with bruises but believed Richard's explanation about a fall. A local pastor came forward, ashamed, admitting that Richard had approached him about performing a family commitment ceremony. But he'd refused, thinking it was strange but not criminal. He'd never reported it. Society had failed these girls, and now society had to face that failure. The trial began in January 1967. By then, Marianne had given birth to a baby girl. The child was immediately placed in foster care. Marianne signed away her parental rights, unable to bear the thought of raising a child conceived in horror. The prosecution presented a devastating case. Medical evidence, journals, photographs, testimonies, the fake marriage documents. Expert witnesses testified about grooming, manipulation, and long-term psychological control. Richard's defense argued mental illness, claimed the girls had been influenced by outside forces, suggested they'd misunderstood his actions as a widowed father trying to maintain a close family. It took the jury 4 hours to convict him on multiple counts of assault, false imprisonment, and violations too numerous to list here. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison. In 1967, it was one of the harshest sentences ever handed down for domestic crimes. But the judge, a woman named Margaret Thornton, made it clear why. "Mr. Holloway, you didn't just commit crimes against your daughters. You systematically destroyed their childhoods, their sense of self, their ability to trust. You used your position as their protector to become their tormentor. There is no punishment severe enough for what you've done, but I will ensure you never have the opportunity to hurt anyone again." Richard showed no emotion as he was led away. But as he passed the gallery where his daughters sat, he looked directly at Catherine and whispered something only she could hear. "You'll never be free of me." He was right in a way. The years that followed were not easy for the Holloway sisters. Freedom didn't erase trauma. Safety didn't heal wounds that deep. Marianne struggled the most. The pregnancy, the baby she'd given up, the years of violation. They haunted her. She attempted to end her life twice in the first year after the trial. But slowly, with therapy and support, she began to heal. She changed her name, moved to Oregon, became a teacher, never married, never had children, but she found peace in her own way. Eloise, the youngest, worked hard to reclaim her childhood. She was placed with a foster family in another state, good people who understood trauma and gave her space to heal. She went to college, became a social worker specializing in abuse cases. Dedicated her life to helping other children escape the kind of hell she'd survived. Catherine became an advocate. She spoke at schools, at conferences, at legislative hearings. She testified in favor of stronger laws protecting children. She wrote a book about their experience, names changed, details altered for privacy, that helped thousands of survivors feel less alone. The three sisters remained close, talking every week, visiting when they could. Bound together by shared trauma, but also by survival, by the fact that they'd escaped, that they'd told the truth, that they'd survived. Eleanor Pritchard lived to be 92. She attended the trial every single day, testified powerfully about what she'd witnessed, and maintained contact with the girls for the rest of her life. When she passed in 1986, all three sisters attended her funeral. They stood together at her grave and thanked her for having the courage to act when so many others had looked away. Eleanor's journal, the one she'd kept for all those years, documenting everything she'd seen, was donated to a museum dedicated to survivors of familial violence. It's still there today, a reminder that sometimes one person's awareness, one person's willingness to get involved, can save lives. Richard Holloway died in prison in 2003. He never admitted guilt, never apologized, never showed remorse. When Catherine learned of his death, she didn't feel relief. She didn't feel joy or sadness. She just felt tired. "He's gone," she told her sisters during a call that night. "Finally gone." "Are we free now?" Eloise asked, her voice small despite being 47 years old. Marianne, who'd been quiet throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "We've been free since the day we walked into that diner. He just couldn't accept it. But we were always free. We just had to learn to believe it." In 2014, a documentary filmmaker approached the sisters. She wanted to tell their story, to bring awareness to the issue of familial trafficking and abuse, to show how predators can hide in plain sight, protected by social norms and people's reluctance to get involved. The sisters agreed, on the condition that their identities would be protected and that the focus would be on prevention and education, not sensationalism. The documentary aired in 2016. It won awards, it changed laws, it started conversations, and it saved lives. Because somewhere out there, a child watched it with their parent who noticed something was wrong. A teacher recognized signs they'd been missing. A neighbor decided to trust their instincts and make a phone call. The cycle of silence was broken. Today, in 2025, the three sisters are in their 70s. Marianne lives quietly in Oregon, tending to her garden and volunteering at a women's shelter. Eloise recently retired from social work, though she still consults on difficult cases. Catherine continues to speak, to write, to fight for stronger protections for children. They've lived full lives, not perfect lives, not lives without pain or struggle, but lives lived on their own terms. And perhaps that's the real victory. Not that they survived, but that they didn't let their trauma define them. They took the worst thing that ever happened to them and transformed it into purpose, into advocacy, into hope for others. The house at 1847 Ashwood Lane was demolished in 1970. A small park stands there now, with a bench dedicated to Eleanor Pritchard and a plaque that reads, "When you see something, say something. Your courage could save a life." Some people ask if stories like this should be told. If shining a light on such darkness serves any purpose, the answer is yes. Always yes. Because for every story that's told, there are hundreds that remain buried. Hundreds of children still trapped. Hundreds of families keeping terrible secrets. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people hear these stories, if enough people learn to recognize the signs, if enough people find the courage to act like Eleanor did, maybe fewer children will have to suffer in silence. Maybe more will find their voices. Maybe more will escape. The wedding dress they found buried in 1979, the one that started this investigation, it belonged to Mary Ann. She'd buried it that winter night in 1966, trying to bury the memory with it, trying to kill some part of herself so that another part could survive. When police showed it to her years later, asking if she wanted it back, she shook her head. "Burn it," she said quietly. "Burn it and scatter the ashes. Some things don't deserve to be preserved. Some memories need to die so that people can live." They honored her request. This is the untold tragedy of the sisters who married their own father. But it's also the story of 3 girls who found the courage to speak, of an elderly woman who chose to act, of a justice system that, for once, listened. It's a dark story, a painful story, a story that's hard to hear, but it's also a story of survival, of resilience, of the unbreakable bonds between sisters who refuse to let evil win. And in the end, perhaps that's the most important part. Not the darkness they endured, but the light they became. The end.